Okay, so we're continuing our series today on the Christian and the Christian minister, and we're talking today about the Christian evangelist. We talked a little bit last week to introduce the subject, so I'll just recap a little bit there. There we are. So we talked about the Christian elder. The Christian elder is somebody who ministers the word. If a person's a deacon, they're serving the Lord too, and they're also a minister, but they don't have the responsibility to preach, whereas both pastors and evangelists do, so they're both elders together. And we don't have anybody designated as an elder evangelist in this church, except perhaps me. I've been an evangelist in the past, so I would be an elder evangelist as well as being an elder pastor. And we talked about the fact that the evangelist is an expert in the field of evangelism, and his job in the church is not to go off and do it all by himself, but to help the church to be able to reach out together. That's the particular point. And so if we have an evangelist on the eldership team, then he would be the person who would encourage and teach the church and lead the church in evangelism, and also he would be the person when we have a church meeting who would raise the subject of evangelism, and it would put it on the agenda. So that's really very, very, very important point. And most churches that I've been a member of don't ever do that, but that's how it really ought to be. People in churches need to be taught about evangelism, and they also need to be led in evangelism. So that's very, very important. The Christian evangelist understands the gospel, but he also understands people, and he's able to communicate to them in a manner that they can understand. And as a result of his ministry in a church, people are constantly being saved because more people are being contacted with the gospel. And the Christian elder evangelist is fully aware of all the theories and the common man's ideas. And so he's able to address people in the things that they think about, and he's able to correct mistakes, and he's able to teach the scriptures, because he is very much a preacher. That's what an evangelist is, very much a preacher and a teacher. And he spends some of his time visiting unbelievers that the Lord has placed on his heart. So he might have, say, a concern for a small area, or he might have a concern for a village or a larger mission. And what he would do, he would be engaged in reaching people himself, but he would be encouraging people to come along with him so that they might learn to do the same. So today we're talking still about the Christian evangelist, and the first thing is that the Christian evangelist is very concerned to establish the main platform for his ministry. Okay, what we mean by that, we mean literally the platform. We mean the place where the preaching of the gospel is conducted. The evangelist considers that to be his main sphere of ministry, his main sphere. That is on the understanding that people do come in that are not Christians. If people come in that are not Christians, then it would be his job to do primarily the preaching of the gospel. So he's dedicated to bringing the gospel before people in such a way that they learn and that they are challenged with the most important decision of their lives. What will you do with Jesus, who is called Christ, is a classic question. And he gives listeners an opportunity to respond to the gospel and to come for counseling. He also spends some of his time answering the difficult questions that non-Christians have. And that's a great challenge, because a lot of people, in my experience, that come forward, they want to know about Christianity, but they have questions. And so that would be the Christian evangelist's main field of interest. Yeah. That's why on the internet, once a week, we have a small session called Christian Answers, and we have a site dedicated to that concept, where we go through all the philosophical and all of the cultural questions that people have. That's one of the most interesting and one of the most, the most popular thing that we do on the internet is Christian Answers. So we highly recommend people, it's just 1 hour and we just go through the questions that people ask. Now, the Christian elder may encounter opposition. He may encounter opposition outside the church in his ministry for a while. That wouldn't be considered to be unusual. That would be considered to be very normal. And that opposition might be people shouting or people being aggressive, because that sadly is what happens in today's world. But it doesn't have to be like that. And sometimes you might go through a long period of time in which there's no opposition whatsoever. So, for example, for a period of about 8 or 9 years, preaching around the villages of Shropshire and Wales, we encountered virtually no opposition whatsoever, virtually none. I think we might have only encountered what you would call opposition twice. One was from a very angry guy, and we were soon able to pacify him. And another one was from I think he was the local church warden or something like that. And he was just asking questions, but he was doing it in a fairly aggressive manner. But apart from those two incidents, really nothing else. Nothing else. Of course, depends on the attitude and the disposition of the person. I went out with one evangelist when I was very young, and I don't know what was the matter with him, but he had a problem. And everywhere he went, people would shout at him, and he just had a manner that rubbed people up the wrong way. And if you do that, then you will get a response, but you won't get the response that you want. You get a negative response. So it's not uncommon to have opposition. It may cause a bit of a shake-up in the community in which one is working. A dear friend of mine, a man who's with the Lord now, he went to a church to do a mission, and he was there for about a month. And when he used to go to the local shop and buy himself an apple midday, because he would have breakfast from somebody and he'd have an evening meal, and midday he'd just have an apple and a cup of tea. So he would always go to the local shop, buy one apple, and the lady in the shop said to him, she said, "I've seen you about. What are you doing at the moment?" And he said, "Well, I'm just conducting a series of meetings at the church." And she said, "Are you the person that's going to be the speaker?" He said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I hope you'll come one night and listen." And she said, "We had some trouble in the past." And he said, "Did you? What happened?" He said, "Well, that little group up in that church decided that they were going to start praying for this place." He said, "It was terrible." She said, "It was terrible." He said, "What was terrible about it?" She said, "You could feel God's presence everywhere you went." She said, "And everybody felt bad. They felt bad about themselves, and they felt bad about God." And he said, "And what was the result in the end?" She said, "A lot of people were converted." And he said, "Well, I'm afraid that is my job. That is my job. I don't annoy people. I don't try to annoy people, but I do seek to help people to find Christ in their lives." And you can understand how that in that particular village at that time, at a particular time in the past, they had there was opposition. I don't think it manifested itself in anything that outstanding, but the local people didn't like the Christians praying, and they didn't like the fact. She said the problem is, she said, you could feel God everywhere in the village, and all I would say is, praise the Lord. That's exactly what they should be feeling. And so that just goes to show what can happen in the ministry of an evangelist. Also, I would say that sometimes in the ministry of an evangelist, you get trouble in the church. Okay, you get a certain person getting up and saying, "I don't like the preaching." And then they spread this bad attitude amongst everybody, and it can create a lot of conflict within the church. Okay, can do. But it doesn't always happen like that. And depending on how the evangelist conducts himself, generally speaking, that can be pacified quite well. There we are. So is this a bit of an insight? Are you finding this a bit of an insight? Because you're living the Christian life, but you don't see what is happening on the other side, what's happening with the ministers or the deacons or with evangelists. It's a very interesting topic altogether. Now, the Christian elder is also sometimes a pioneer missionary. So a pioneer missionary, the word pioneer has the idea that the Christian minister is moving out into a community. Okay, he's doing pioneer work. He may not even have a building that he can use to preach from, but he can talk to people on a one-to-one basis. He can talk to them at their doors, or he can talk to them in the street. That's very, very common and very, very, very effective. Or he might, for example, conduct children's services in, say, a village hall. That also is exceptionally effective. And when I was quite young, in the age of 30-ish and something like that, I would travel with other people all over this country conducting tent missions. So we'd set up a tent on the village green and we would speak to everybody and we'd fill it with people and we'd preach the gospel. And we did that in many, many villages all over the place. It was for me, first time I'd ever done that. I'd heard it done and I'd seen it done, but it was the first time I'd actually worked in that way myself. And it was very thrilling. Christians came from everywhere. And every night at 7 o'clock, we'd have a service. We'd have some good singing. And then one of the evangelists would preach the gospel. And we saw a lot of people converted in that manner. It was at one time exceptionally common to do that. At the end of the last war, the Second World War, it was in people's minds that they could camp and they could have a tent and they could hire a tent and whatever and conduct meetings. And many, many churches around this country have been founded simply by having a tent campaign like that. Yeah, it's very, very effective. So the purpose of the pioneer missionary then is to go from place to place where there is no church. And surprisingly, although in every village you'll find a little parish church pretty well, most villages, there's hamlets and there's places where the gospel doesn't really reach. In fact, we used to go in the early days to a little village on the west of Shrewsbury called Lower Common. Lower Common was probably about 16 or 17 houses, very isolated hamlet. And I began to do open air preaching there. And to give you an idea, Ruth and I drove through the village just the other day, funnily enough, just on a little journey we had. And it has a lot of affection to me. I met an awful lot of people there and had a lot of conversations with them about the Lord. It was one of those amazing places. And one of the last times that I ever went there, I met a lady and I'd knocked on her door many, many times. Can't remember the name of the house now. And just give her a tract and asked her how she was and so on. And she said, you're Stephen, aren't you? I said, yes, I am Stephen. She said, I remember you coming last time. And it must have been about a year since when I'd been. And she said, I remember what you talked about as well. I said, do you? Yes, she said, you spoke on John 3:16. I said, oh, did I? And what did I say? And she said, you emphasized God so loved the world. And you said it about 6 times. And it stuck in my head. And she said, for weeks, all I could think about was the fact that God so loved the world. And I said, well, that's very touching that you remember that. Oh, no, she said, I won't forget it. I wrote it all down at the time. And she showed me her handwriting. It was beautiful, very, very tiny handwriting, but she'd recorded everything that I'd said. So this is the work of a pioneer missionary. It's an amazing work. And you meet people in circumstances like that, which may never have ever heard the gospel. I'll give you one more incident. We had a little mission. There was just 2 of us on it. I went to Bass Church. You all know where Bass Church is. It's just in the north of Shropshire. And we went there. We had no idea where we would preach, but we we drove around the village and we found there was a big green surrounded by houses all facing it. And I said to my friend, I said, hey, this is the ideal place. We can go here. And so we stopped. And we don't just stop and get out and start preaching. What we do, we knock at everyone's doors and introduce themselves by name and explain who we are. And then what we do is we say, invite them to come out and listen to the preaching. We call it a small talk. And when the time came, he said that the person that was accompanying me had never done anything like this before. He said, "Oh, you better do the preaching because I'm not used to this." I said, "Oh, that's okay." I was talking to him just the other day on the internet, and so he got out, and we got out, and I started to preach. It was just like a normal 5 or maybe 10-minute talk maximum. That's all. And I just explained the gospel, explained who we were and why we were there and what the gospel is that we're bringing. And at the end of the conversation, at the end of the preaching, a lady came out of a house. She was just in front of us and she walked over. And I said, I knew her because she used to live in Shrewsbury and she was a Christian. So she came over and she shook my hand. She said, "It's so nice to see you here." She said, "This is a God-forsaken place." I said, "It's not God-forsaken. It's just a place where people are. And if people are here, then it'll never be forsaken of God." And she said, "Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true." But she said, "But they don't believe here." I said, "Well, that's why we've come. We've come to tell people about what it is to believe." And we had a conversation and she said, "Would you do me the honor of having a cup of tea at my house?" I went, "Yeah." I said, "We won't come in, but we'll just have it at the front door." She said, "Oh, that's fine." So we went over and she just gave us 2 mugs and we stood there talking about what we'd done and about the Lord and all that. Anyway, we thought nothing of it and we got back in the car and off we went. The interesting thing is that at that particular place, a lot of people came out. A lot of people came to windows or to doors or to the hedge at the front of the garden to listen. So it was a good place to go to. And about a week later, I was walking across the square in Shrewsbury, just crossing it, and I heard a voice, "Stephen, Stephen." I thought, "Is that me?" And I turned around and she was marching to see me again. And she came across and she said, "Oh," she said, "I'm so glad I've found you." I said, "Okay, how can I help you?" She said, "I forgot to tell you on the day." I said, "Okay, what did you forget?" "I forgot to tell you that my daughter was upstairs in bed. She wasn't very well. And would you pray for her?" I said, "Yes, certainly. We'll always pray for her." And then she said, "And there's something else as well. She opened the window and she listened to all of your talk and she became a Christian on the spot." And so we were just praising the Lord about that. It's amazing how the simplicity of preaching on a village green, when you've introduced yourself, because when you introduce yourself, all the barriers come down. They know who you are, they know your name, and they know why you're there. And it just goes to show that God can touch people's lives just like that. It didn't cost any church a penny for us to go, except a little bit of petrol to get there and come back. And it just goes to show how very effective pioneer evangelism can be. Now, in those early days, I had no idea, or hardly any idea about follow-up, hardly any idea about what to do with new Christians, what to teach them, and so on. But it was one of those things that sparked me into ministry amongst Christians. And I began to study and look at what could be done to help new Christians. And that began a whole life of ministry in which we've ended up here. This is where we are at the moment, of course. It just goes to show what can be done in the life of somebody who wants to serve the Lord. That's what. So now we're going to move to a second section in our series of talks, and we just call it the Christian pastor. The Christian pastor is an expert in the field of pastoral ministry. You may not realize that, but Christian pastors will have done a lot of study. If they're a Baptist pastor, they'll have been to Baptist college to learn all about theology and all about the Bible and all about how to conduct pastoral ministry. They will have an interest always in evangelism. They'll always have an interest in it. But he regularly meets with the leadership team of the church to plan ministry. Now, in this particular church at this particular time, there's mainly 2 of us that preach. Is that right? Yeah. So what we will do is we will just have a conversation together, and I will say to Harley, I'll say, so when would you like to be preaching again? And he'll say, well, what about, a couple of 3 weeks time? And I'll say, yeah, that's fine. Yes, let's do that. And so I will encourage him to, come and minister the word as God has gifted him to do it. So Harley then is an elder with pastoral gifting, okay, and also evangelistic gifting. Is that right? Yeah. So that's so in this church, there's not a one-man ministry. There's like a double ministry in which you have 2 people who minister the word. And this is the biblical pattern, really, because whenever Paul or whenever the apostles are writing to churches in the New Testament times, they always speak about the elders with an S at the end. There's always more than one. Of course, there doesn't always have to be one. Sometimes in New Testament times, there might be a little church that just has one person that can minister the word. That's nothing wrong with that, There's nothing wrong with having one person. But the ideal is that there would be more than one. And what the Lord does is he does encourage pastors to work with anybody in the church that's interested so that they can develop their gift in ministering the word. That's the biblical pattern. So famous people like this, if you take someone like, say, George Muller, everybody knows George Muller. And what they don't realize is that he had a colleague called Craig. And Craig was a very gifted Bible teacher. And so they very much worked together. And in Muller's life, there became a conflict between the 2 of them. You couldn't even imagine a conflict between 2 men like these. But there became a conflict because it suddenly became apparent that when George was preaching, nobody was converted. But when his colleague was preaching, there were always people converted. And so when he became aware of this, George was very concerned, and he went to speak to his colleague about it. And his colleague said, well, I don't really know about the details of that. I haven't personally observed that myself. And he said, yeah, it's become apparent to me that when you preach, people are converted, but not when I preach. And so instead of having a huff and parting company for life, they got together to pray. And it slowly became apparent when they analyzed it that George Muller's preaching didn't focus on the person of Christ that much, whereas his colleague's ministry was always focused on Christ. And so we can understand immediately why he was having the success in evangelism and his brother wasn't. And that just goes to show how that in a church, you might have 2 people serving the Lord, and there doesn't have to be a rivalry. There can be cooperation and there can be sweet fellowship. This is just so absolutely essential. So the pastor is an expert in pastoral ministry, but that doesn't mean they're not interested in gospel preaching, because it's part of the pastor's work to be evangelistically literate, I call it. Somebody that's able to speak on the subject of the gospel and is able to do it very adequately and will see God's blessing on it. That's very important. So, but the pastor's gift, the work of the pastor, is primarily to enable the church to be cared for, to be looked after, and his ministry is characterized by the Lord as that of a shepherd. Now, we all know what shepherds do. They're not there to eat the sheep. They're there to look after the sheep. They're there to rescue the sheep when they get lost, and they're there to help those that are injured or hurting. That's exactly what the Christian pastor is supposed to be doing. And it will be up to you to judge whether that's what you find in me. But hopefully that you would find that to see in my ministry. And the pastor's aim is the spiritual health of those under his care and their personal development. I remember the first meeting I ever went to of the ministers of this county, which was 16 years ago. They said to me, "So what's going to be the main thrust of your ministry?" I thought, well, that's a good question on my first day with them. And I said, well, the main thrust of my ministry is to be eventually putting myself out of a job. And they all looked at me stunned and went, what? I said, yeah, my ministry is already developed. So my job is to help you to develop your ministry, whatever that might be. If you're a deacon, then you'll have a specific role and you'll have specific responsibilities. And if you're a minister of the word, you also will have a role and responsibilities. And my job is to help you to develop. That's my role. So that I'm the one who sits and listens as well. Yeah. The pastor's aim then is the spiritual health of those that he oversees. And it's not his job to do every role. I don't want to ever be treasurer. I don't want to ever be caretaker. I do some caretakering occasionally, don't I? And I do odd jobs and stuff. And I have an interest in treasuryship. I have an interest in the children's work, an interest in lots of areas, but they're not my aim. My aim is simply to ensure that those doing the task do the task well to the best of their ability. And my job is to just be an overseer, to watch over it and check the things are done decently and orderly. That's the point. That's all I'm interested in, really. So I don't want your job, Harley, okay? I don't want any of that. I just want to help you and support you and encourage you, okay? And make sure that you get it, you get the support that you need and the finance and all the rest of it that you need to do your job. That's the purpose there. So the pastor understands the message of the Bible exceptionally well. People don't really know how much pastors do in their study, but it's not unusual for pastors to be spending whole days in study and in prayer. And people would say, how would you study the Bible for a whole day? Oh, when you've got a service to take and God speaks to you and enables you to have an interest in a particular subject that you know will be of benefit to people, time just seems to stop. And you could study for 7 or 8 hours without breaking. You know, it's one of those things that becomes very absorbing, and also in prayer. So he understands the message of the Bible very well, and most pastors will have done some sort of theological training, and they will also have a very, very in-depth knowledge of the Bible. And I work with people on the internet, and there's a number of people that I work with who are ministers in their own little churches all around the world, and my job is to encourage them and to inspire them and to teach them the scriptures, and that's what we've been doing on the internet all the time that I've been here and beyond before. So when the internet first started, I was involved working with people in South Wales, and they began a thing called Our Life is a Prayer. And it was just a chat room in which about 20 or so Christians would come. And they would, in fact, at one stage, we went through a stage, Ruth and I, where people were coming every day for 1 hour. And we'd go through the life of Christ over there. And we did studies on the internet like that for about a year, every single day. That's a huge commitment, because it isn't just the study, it's the study that you need to do to prepare for the study. Okay? There needs to be a lot of background work done, because you can't turn up at a study and have nothing to say or nothing to talk about. So it does involve a lot of background work. There is another form of pastoral work, stroke evangelistic work, because sometimes these ministries overlie each other. There's another form of ministry called the revivalist. And certainly most pastors are revivalists at heart. And what we mean by that is The revivalist is a person who has a very deep experience of God in his life, in searchings and in repentance, and his job is to enable the people of the church, the Christians of the church, to deal with issues in their lives in such a way that the joy of the Lord and a clear conscience lights up in their lives, and they become free in their own ministry and become very effective in their calling. So, for example, if the person is an evangelist, then he will become very free in evangelism, and that will normally result in a transformation of the whole community, where people are converted generally in large numbers. So that's the revivalist's ministry. And most pastors have a revivalist's heart, so a great interest in this. And we could talk a great deal, really, about the work of a revivalist. In Wales, the land of revivals, about 16 different revivals occurred in Wales over the last probably about at least 300 years. And each revival would be different. Sometimes they would be in a small locality, but most of the time they would encompass the whole of Wales. And they would last for a brief time. The last major revival we had in 1905 lasted for only 3 months. I don't mean it petered out. What I mean is the main fervor was about 3 months. And people just stopped working. They couldn't work. And they would just turn up at church and the place would be packed. And then God would send a revivalist. And what the revivalists do is he'd preach sin and hell and judgment, and they would weep and they would be saved in very large numbers. So in 1905, for example, in 3 months, there were 110,000 converts in Wales. That was something like about 50% of the whole population. Incredible, really. And even now, if you go to Wales on a Sunday, it's very difficult to buy a beer. Not that I would want one, I don't drink it. But the point is, it is difficult because the revival in Wales at that time was an anti-drinking revival as well. And there was a tremendous amount of bankruptcies in Wales at that time. But the people that went bankrupt were the pub landowners, because they just couldn't sell the stuff. And they would roll the beer barrels into the street and put an axe through it, and it would all go down the drain because they couldn't sell it, you see. But there was other things as well. The police had a massive revival, and they had a custom in Wales that every year the police chief with his officers would turn up at the magistrate's court, and he would bring a white cushion, okay? And on the white cushion was a white glove, and he presented to the magistrate. That wasn't done every year, but it was done on a year when there was no crime. Can you imagine that now? A year when there was no crime. I spoke to a lady about it in Dorgethley one day, and she said, oh yes, we hear about this a lot. She said, we still don't have crime here. I said, don't you? She said, I'm the police liaison officer, so I answer the phone and I do all of the communication and stuff. And she said, it was very exciting. I said, what was? She said, we had a murder once. And I said, what, once? She said, yeah, we've never had one since. She said, because we're a small community, everybody knew who'd done it. So it was solved very quickly. But you see, that's the legacy of revival. God swept through those communities and transformed lives. And just recently we were in Wales and we visited the place of Mary Jones's birthplace, the little house where she lived, and she was a heroine of Wales. She was only 16 when she finally managed to get hold of a Bible in Welsh. But she had to walk 40 miles barefoot across the mountains to Bala to get hold of a Bible in Welsh. And it was a rather large Bible, like a pulpit Bible there, beautifully produced. But she loved the Lord and she wanted to read the Bible in Welsh. And what she did, she sparked a tremendous revolution in Wales amongst children. And children would come to her in her little cottage, in dozens of them at a time, and she would teach them to read the Welsh Bible. What a great thing, you know. So that's the work of revivalists. It has a tremendous impact on society, and it brings about the conversion of very large numbers of people. My Ruth's family, when we go back into the history of Ruth's family, we discover that there were a number of key people in South Wales, where all her family comes from, and one of them was a revivalist. Not quite sure which revival he was involved in, but it was probably the 1858 revival. The 58 revival was very special. It was produced by the Calvinistic Methodists. They were the revivalists at the time, and they went through the whole of Wales. They had a special plan, which they followed. They called it the Forward Movement Plan. They would conduct open-air services. They'd conduct children's services. They'd conduct schools where they would teach the people to read and write, and they would teach them to read the Bible in particular. And it absolutely woke Wales right up. And suddenly you've got coal miners that can read. What does a coal miner need to read for? He needs to read so he can read his Bible. And they would go down sometimes in the morning, down into the mines. And they'd be down there at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. But they say, before we work, we're going to pray. And they would pray and pray and pray in the utter darkness. No lights at all. And the effect of that work was tremendous. It was a huge, huge, huge work of God. So there we are. And also in my family, distant family, we have a person that's up in the northeast. Some of our family come from up in the northeast. And he was also a revivalist. I've got to learn more about this guy, but he used to, in modern times, he used to have a radio program where he used to preach the gospel. And he was a sort of a very minor celebrity there. But the main thing is that he was a revivalist, and he used to go into villages and towns and preach the gospel on a regular basis. So revival is something that's a thing. It's a thing amongst Christianity. And generally, revivalists, you could think of Billy Graham and various other people that we know as being revivalists, really, because their job was not just to get on a platform and preach. Their job was to get in amongst the churches and encourage them to pray. That's really, and of course, in 59 in the Hebrides in Scotland, there was a very famous revival that occurred at the end of the Second World War, and the whole of the population of those islands were converted in Barvas and so on. It was a tremendous revival. It was a very, very dark place initially. All the young people never went to church. None of them ever went to church. And there were two elderly sisters. They were real sisters, two sisters. They both were in their 90s, and they began to pray. And when an evangelist finally found his way there, these two sisters were very strong-willed and strong-minded people. And they said to the revivalist who came, they said, "Do you fear God?" And he said, "Well, yes, I think I do fear God." They said, "Well, you're not going to be any good to us if you don't." Right? And then the one lady who was completely blind, she said, "Do you believe in the gospel?" He said, "I do believe in the gospel." She said, "Well, then you'll do then. You'll do, because that's what we need here. We need the gospel." And the very first, he stepped off the boat, because it's an island, stepped off the boat and came up the passageway towards the town. I hope I'm telling it right. And he was met by a church warden, I think. And he said, "Yes, so I'll take you up to the church. We have a prayer meeting happening tonight." And he said, "Oh, have you?" They said, "Would you like to say a few words?" He said, "Well, I haven't really prepared anything, but yes, I can say something, you know." And he came into this church, and it was full of people, and a prayer meeting was running, and there were various people were praying, and at the very, very end of it, the church warden said, "Well, I think it's really time for everybody to go home." Okay, it's like 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was. And so they all sort of they said, yes, okay, we probably ought to get some sleep. So as they were moving towards the door, one of the elders in the church stood up and started to pray. And because of respect for him, they all stopped and prayed with him. And he said, "Lord, let it come. Let the blessing come." Okay? And when they opened the church doors to go out, they found the whole village. When they spoke to people about it, they said, why did you come at this time of night? They said, "Well, God brought us here, and we want to get saved." And the whole village converted at that very night, in the middle of the night. So experiences like that are absolutely precious, and that's the work of revivalists. Yeah, we are. So that's next week, God willing, we will continue with the work of a pastor, and we'll talk about his education some more, and we'll talk about other aspects of his work. It's as you can imagine, it's a very big subject, and there we are. We'll come to it next week, God willing. Thank you, everybody.